Welcome to the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Those of you who know me or who have been to any of the seminars know that I am fond of a quote attributed to Albert Einstein. The important thing is to not stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. To that, I would like to add one more line that resonates with me. It's from a 1935 issue of the Saturday Evening Post in an article by Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote, "I think at a child's birth, if a mother could ask a fairy godmother to endow it with the most useful gift, that gift should be curiosity." Whether or not you believe in fairy godmothers, you're here today because you are curious people. So thank you for both your presence and your curiosity. Thank you as well to Tandon Executive Dean Juan de Pablo, who also serves as NYU's first Executive VP for Global Science and Technology, and Senior Vice Dean Ari Odell for their support, and to my own Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering for hosting the seminar series in Modern Artificial Intelligence. I launched this series 7 years ago, and it has been among the greatest pleasures of my career to see it evolve into a significant event in the AI world and a vehicle for unifying scientific communities around the influential research ideas of today that can have a major impact tomorrow. Now, considering those quotes I mentioned a moment ago, you can probably imagine just how excited I am about today's presentation, which is entitled Curiosity Styles in the Natural and Artificial Wild. What could be a better topic for us as curious people? Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Danny S. Bassett is well known for blending neural and systems engineering to identify fundamental mechanisms of cognition and disease in human brain networks. The G. Peters Skin Coverage Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with appointments in the Department of Bioengineering, Electrical and Systems Engineering, Physics and Astronomy, Neurology, and Psychiatry. They're also an external professor of the Santa Fe Institute. Danny received a BS in physics from the Penn State University and a PhD in the same discipline from the University of Cambridge, where they were a Churchill Scholar and an NIH Health Science Scholar. And following a postdoctoral position at UC Santa Barbara, they became a junior research fellow at the Sage Center for the Study of the Mind. The author of more than 450 peer-reviewed publications that have collectively garnered over 58,000 citations, as well as numerous book chapters and teaching materials, Danny also recently co-authored the book Curious Minds, The Power of Connection, with philosopher Perry Zurn. So I think that many of us here will be making a trip to the bookstore soon. Danny has received multiple prestigious awards, including the American Psychological Association's Rising Star designation, an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, the prize commonly known as the MacArthur Fellow Genius Grant, an NSF Career Awards, the Lagrange Prize in Complex Systems Science, mentioned as one of Popular Science magazine's Brilliant 10, and recognition from numerous other organizations, including the IEEE Engineering and Medicine and Biology Society, the Office of Naval Research, and the American Physical Society. I also just mentioned that Danny has been named one of the Web of Science most highly cited researchers for 4 years running. I could go on listing their many laurels, but I, for one, am burning with curiosity about what we are going to be learning today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Danny S. Bassett.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm going to quickly, this is unmuted. Okay, great. So today what I want to do is to tell you about some of our work in curiosity. I've titled this Curiosity Styles in the Natural and Artificial Wild. And over the next couple of minutes, what I want to do is to walk along this road where we'll begin in philosophy. We'll move then into psychology and studying individual humans. Then we'll move to human behavior across the globe, across 50 different countries and 14 different languages. And at the end, I want to ask how those pieces help us to ask new questions in AI. So first, I want to start with the question, what is curiosity? Each of us might have a different image in our minds when we think about the idea of curiosity. We might think about Trivial Pursuit, for example, a love of trivia. We might think about the toddler who asks an unending string of questions. We might think of asking questions in a classroom by raising your hand. But the question of what curiosity is something that we as humans have been asking for a very long time. If I just focus on the Western intellectual tradition, then we can go back, for example, to St. Augustine in 397, who writes that curiosity is a lust to experience and find out. Or fast forward about 1,000 years, we can go to Thomas Aquinas in 1270, who writes curiosity is the desire to know. Descartes in 1649 writes that curiosity is a desire to understand. John Locke in 1693 says that curiosity is an appetite after knowledge. William James suggests that curiosity is the impulse toward better cognition. And we can go on. We can sort of map out what these definitions are over this period of time. I'll also note that it is a limitation that this set is all from the Western intellectual tradition. We could do something similar from other intellectual traditions, indigenous traditions, Eastern intellectual traditions, etc. So, but if we take all of those definitions, there are a couple common themes. So one is that all of them focus on the individual. There's one person, there's a subject, there's a human, there's an organism. And then they all list some kind of impetus, whether they name it a desire, an appetite, an impulse, an interest, or a motivation. And then there's something at the end, the object, a unit of knowledge. So that we have an individual has a desire to know X. So these traditional definitions are individual, but they're also acquisitional because they're focused on acquiring a piece of knowledge. So that's the consistent traditional definition. But what's interesting is that even among this same set of literature, there's also a hidden history of more relational definitions. So not acquisitional, but relational. And I want to pull out 3 examples of that. For example, this first one, which is very early from 1531, reads, with curiosity, some things follow from the findings of others. Just as when the beginning of a thread is secured, it is found to be connected with another set of things quite different from those which were being examined. So this focuses on curiosity as something that follows a thread, and that's very relational. That's not necessarily let me grab this thing and stick it in my pocket, which is the acquisitional picture I want you to have in your mind. This is about following a thread. It is relational, it's connective, it's forward moving. And then look at Charles Sanders Peirce, who writes that curiosity is stimulated by the rational relations between things. So when our curiosity is stimulated, it's not necessarily that there's an object of information out there. It's that we understand the relationship between that piece of information and what we already know. What's exciting is connecting that new bit to our current knowledge. And then lastly, John Dewey in 1916 writes that knowledge is a perception of those connections of an object which determine its applicability in a given situation. And ideally, perfect knowledge would represent such a network of interconnections that any past experience would offer a point of advantage from which to get at the problems presented in a new experience. So what he's saying is that number 1, knowledge is a pattern of interconnections. And number 2, that's useful because that's how we can solve new problems. We take something from the past that we've learned and apply it in a new situation. So again, that's very relational. It's connecting the past and the present. It's connecting pieces of information to one another. So this is a sort of hidden history of relational definitions. So Perry Zurn is a philosopher and colleague, and what he wanted to do is to go back through texts in the Western intellectual tradition and identify styles of curiosity that have this relational underpinning. How is curiosity spoken about in literature, in history, in philosophical texts over the last 2,000 years? And in doing that, what he focused on are words for curiosity in Greek, in Latin, in French, in German, and in English. So again, just acknowledging the limitation that this is just a snapshot of the Western intellectual tradition over the last 2,000 years. It would be really interesting to do this in other intellectual traditions. But in doing so, what he found is that there are 3 very consistent styles of curiosity that are described. The first one is the busybody, the second one is the hunter, and the third one is the dancer. This first one, the busybody, that's kind of it's an older term, and it's sort of, you can think about it as what we would describe as a social butterfly, someone who kind of flits around a social space, but imagine that person in an epistemic milieu. So they're flitting around between ideas. So you can sort of think about this as an epistemic butterfly rather than a social butterfly. Okay, so the busybody. What I'm going to do is to share with you 3 different example texts for these styles, and then I'll tell you how we can think about those in relational terms. So first, for the busybody, a really good example text is from Plutarch in his On Curiosity, where he writes, "And the busybody, shunning the country as something stale and uninteresting and undramatic, pushes into the bazaar and the marketplace asking, 'Is there any news?'" So this person really doesn't care what the news is. It's not that they care about the content, the specific idea. They're not looking for a piece of information X. They care that there is news, could be anything. So this kind of person is going to be gathering discrete bits of information and building relatively loose knowledge networks. The pieces of information are maybe relatively unrelated to one another. The hunter, by contrast, is nicely exemplified in this passage from Jacques Derrida's The Animal That Therefore I Am, where he writes, "To be curious is to track, to sniff, to trail, and to follow some of the reasons for the so confident usage of words." So what's important about this style of curiosity, as it's described in this literature, is that it follows a trail. It's something that is seeking, but seeking through a set of steps. So again, you can think about that in relation to the thread that we noticed in the previous slide. So the kind of knowledge network that this person is going to be constructing is through a set of very targeted connections, and they're going to build relatively tight knowledge networks. Each piece that they get connects to the other pieces in a passage, in a trail, in some path towards something else. And then lastly, the third style is one that's nicely exemplified by this passage from Michel Foucault's The Masked Philosopher, where he writes, "I can't help but dream about a kind of criticism that would try not to judge, but to bring an idea to life. I'd like a criticism of scintillating leaps of the imagination. I dream of a new age of curiosity." So this dancer style is one that's typically described as somebody who leaps from one idea to another and connects those two together to create something new. So you're thinking about something choreographed, something where a body is leaping in an epistemic space. In scholarly worlds, this is something that is nicely exemplified by people who do interdisciplinary research. So I'm going to connect an idea here to an idea there, and it's by that connection that I can create something new. Or I'm going to take a method from over here and apply it to a problem over here. So it's not a leap for no reason, as the busybody might do. It's a leap to create something out of the two together. Okay, so that individual is going to create something that's more composed of discontinuous concepts and then building these more stringy knowledge networks. Okay, so now that we have those 3 styles in hand from the last 2,000 years of history, literature, and philosophy in the Western intellectual tradition, we want to now move to science and ask, can we see examples of those styles of curiosity in people today? Or is this just a way that we've talked about people in the past? So to answer this question, David Leiden Staley developed an experiment where he asked participants to browse Wikipedia for 15 minutes a day for 21 days, so 3 weeks. And he was, at the time, was a postdoc in my laboratory. He now is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And what he did is that he had 149 volunteers do this Wikipedia browsing study. At the end of the study, we had over 18,000 pages viewed. What I'm showing you on the right-hand side here is an example of 3 of the individuals who were in the study. And each step here, or edge, is a movement that they made from one Wikipedia page to another one. So whenever they're moving between 2 pages, we can calculate the semantic similarity between those 2 pages. And we can say it's a high semantic similarity or low semantic similarity. So we can assess how big the steps are that they're taking. So over here on the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is the cosine similarity between this semantic content of the 2 pages. So more white or light blue is going to mean high similarity, and more dark blue or black is going to mean low similarity. So this first column is a person you can see who mostly takes black steps, meaning that they're going between pages that are very dissimilar to one another. So this is more like the busybody style of curiosity. By contrast, the person on the right-hand side has many more light blue steps. Sorry, over here, they have many more light blue steps, which means that they're moving between pages that are more similar to one another. An example of that person is in one of the individuals in our study took the entire 3 weeks and only looked at Wikipedia pages on the royal family in England. And that's all they did for their 15 minutes. Another person did a similar a similar style of browsing where they just focused on pages in Jewish history. By contrast, this person on the left-hand side, the more busybody-like, they may be moving from a page on rhododendrons to a page on, I don't know, a sports car or something. What we found as we were examining these step sizes is that subclinical levels of depression and anxiety were associated with taking shorter steps on the Wikipedia network. We don't know whether this would translate to clinical levels of depression and anxiety, so that's an open question right now because all of the individuals in our study had only subclinical levels for these markers, but that does motivate some future work. Okay, so with the step sizes in hand, we can now ask what kinds of networks people are building and what are the topologies that they are gathering through their browsing. So our hypothesis was that the hunters are going to build networks where they're moving between pages that are related to one another because they're searching, they're tracking, they're sniffing, they're following a trail. So we would imagine that hunters are going to create networks that have relatively high clustering coefficients. A clustering coefficient is a measure in network science that tells you how likely it is that triangles are present in the network. So when you see triangles, that means that the network will have relatively high clustering coefficient. By contrast, we think that the busybody is going to be somebody who's building a network that has very few triangles, so going to have very little clustering. We also think or hypothesize that the busybody is going to create networks that have relatively high path length, so it's going to take many steps to get from one side to the other, whereas the hunter is going to have a network that has relatively low path length. You can get from one piece to the other relatively quickly. We also hypothesized that these, Yes, the node, sorry, thank you. The node is a Wikipedia page, and then the edge is the semantic similarity between the two pages. We used term frequency, inverse document frequency as one assessment of the edge weight, and then we also looked at just the hyperlink structure as well. So lastly, we hypothesized that individual differences in how people are browsing would correlate with a personality measure that's known as deprivation sensitivity. So if you have high deprivation sensitivity, then you're a kind of person who gets really bothered when you don't have the information that you need. So if it gets really frustrating to you and you feel this affective response when you don't have the information you need, you might be high on deprivation sensitivity. So our hypothesis is that the people who are high in deprivation sensitivity are going to build like the hunters. They're going to follow the trail and they're going to find the pieces that they need to fill in all the holes or the gaps. So here's the first piece of data I wanted to show you from this study. So again, this was 149 participants in the laboratory. And along the x-axis here is the deprivation sensitivity. And then on the y-axis is either the clustering coefficient of the networks that they're walking on or the characteristic path length. And what you can observe is that busybodies are over here on the left-hand side, building networks that have relatively low clustering. They're also the ones that have low deprivation sensitivity. And by contrast, the hunters are over here on the right-hand side. They're building networks with high clustering coefficients, and they have relatively high deprivation sensitivity. I also want you to note that people span this entire continuum. It's not as if there are two kinds of people. There aren't busybodies and hunters. There's this continuum of variation in curiosity styles that span along these two endpoints. Okay, so our next question after this study was, can we generalize those findings? Oh, sorry, yes. That we don't know yet because right now we just have them in browsing. We do know that it is relatively time that that if we look at their browsing patterns in week 1 of the experiment and then week 2 and week 3, somebody who tends to be busybody-like on the first week also tends to be busybody-like on the second and third week. So we know that it's something that's relatively temporally consistent. But we don't know if we had them browsing some other structure, what would happen. Okay, but we did want to generalize. This is still only 149 people, right? So we want to know, is this something we can see over a larger set of people and over different cultural contexts or linguistic contexts? So in order to address that question, we worked with Martin Gerlach, who's a senior research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation. So this is the foundation that is behind Wikipedia. And the student who led this was Dale Zhou, who was a PhD in neuroscience at Penn and is now a postdoc at UC Irvine. What Martin did is that he provided us with de-identified, fully anonymized data from 2 million browsers of the Wiki mobile app. And these browsers are browsing in 50 different countries and on 14 different languages of Wikipedia. So it's important to note that the previous study that I showed you was only on English language Wikipedia. And now we wanted to expand to other languages as well. In this data set, over 16 million unique pages were viewed, and on average, there were about 30 unique page views per reader, some having much, much more, and with people browsing about for 8 days, sometimes more and sometimes less. Now, in order to compare these data to the laboratory data, it was important for us to match the 2 data sets on page views, because the number of pages that are viewed is the number of nodes in the network, and that is highly correlated with some of the network statistics that we're interested in comparing. So we subsampled this data of 2 million down to 482,760 individuals, where the data sets were matched on number of page views. So with these data, we can then compare the topological structure of the networks that are being browsed. So what you're seeing here in blue is what we're calling the naturalistic data. So this is from the Wikimedia Foundation. This is when people are browsing, not knowing that they're part of a study, right? They're just doing it because they're doing it. By contrast, the orange one is the laboratory data, where people did know that we asked them to browse Wikipedia. So what you're seeing here is the PDF of the degree. So that's the number of nodes that are, sorry, the number of edges coming out of a node. And you can see the 2 data sets are relatively matched here. They're also relatively matched on modularity, or the degree of community structure that's present in the networks. They're also matched on the number of communities or groups or modules, and they're very similar also on the mean description length. So these 4 pieces of data suggest to us that the topological organization of the networks that people are building as they're browsing are very consistent, whether they're browsing through the laboratory setting or just on their own in Wikipedia around the world. We then wanted to ask whether we could see evidence for these more busybody-like browsers versus the hunter-like browsers. And so what we are doing here is that we built a single busybody hunter score, where people who score over here are more busybody-like and people who score over here are more hunter-like. This score is, if it's large, it indicates that the networks have greater clustering, but also greater global efficiency, which is a related network measure, and shorter path length, consistent with our earlier hypotheses. So those are the more hunter-like individuals. Again, the laboratory data is in orange here. The blue data is the Wikimedia Foundation data, and then the green is a random walk. So we just set an agent on the Wikipedia network and had it randomly walk it. And so what you can observe is that these 2, the laboratory data and the Wikimedia data, are much more similar to one another than either of them is to the random walk. So again, giving us some indication that the kinds of browsing patterns that we're observing are relatively consistent across the 2 data sets. Now, interestingly, we noticed that busybodies and hunters are tending to browse really different topics. So what I'm showing you here at the top is the categorization that Wikimedia provides for Wikipedia sites. And so it's separated into culture, geography, history and society, and STEM. And then down here, what I'm showing you is 2 different browsers. In pink is a busybody. This is somebody who is browsing over 662 pages. And you can see they're mostly browsing in culture and geography, a little bit in history and society, and a little bit in STEM. The hunter, on the other hand, this is somebody who was browsing 363 pages in the same time period. And you can see they're mostly browsing in STEM, a little bit in history and society, a little bit in geography, and a little bit in culture. So these are just two examples. We wanted to ask, is this something that's really consistent across the entire data set? And the answer is yes. So what you're seeing here along the x-axis is the busybody hunter score that I described earlier. And then along the y-axis is the number of articles visited. I want you to focus just on the top here for a second. In the dark solid line is the empirical data. And what you can see here is that the more busybody-like individuals are browsing many more articles in the culture section than the more hunter-like individuals. There's a very strong relationship here. And that's even stronger than it would be if an agent took a random walk on the Wikipedia network, or if the agent walked on the Wikipedia network, but was kind of biased toward more popular pages. That's the other null model that we had. And then we see a different effect in STEM pages. So what we find is that the hunter-like individuals tend to browse more in the STEM pages than the busybody-like individuals. So there's a positive trend here, not with the same slope as this one, but significantly more positive than expected in these null models. So that suggests that these two kinds of browsers tend to be browsing very different places. Now, you might ask, is the style of the walking on the Wikipedia network simply explained by the fact that the topology of that space is different? So what if the culture pages are organized in a way that is more disparate or sparse? And so the person looks like they're being a busybody, but it's mostly just because they're walking on a space that's sparse and loosely distributed. And similarly, what if the STEM pages are very tightly interconnected with one another, then maybe the person looks like they're browsing like a hunter, but actually it's just because they're on a tightly knit section of Wikipedia, right? So what we did to to determine whether that was a complete explanation is to have an agent walk on these two spaces and separately, so the culture spaces and the STEM spaces, and ask how hunter-like would a random walker be on that space, or how busybody-like would a random walker be in the culture space. And what we found is that humans are browsing in a way that's more busybody-like than expected given the topology, or more hunter-like than expected given the topology. So that suggests to us that our browsing habits might be determined by at least two factors. One is in part the topology we're walking on, and another is just something about us. Something about who we are, maybe our personality traits like deprivation sensitivity, or the goals that we have in coming to Wikipedia. More on that in a second. So the next thing that we found after identifying that busybodies are browsing more of the pages that are in the culture section is that we also see that busybodies are browsing with greater topic diversity. This was a little bit tricky to do because we needed a language agnostic measure of topic diversity because we do have people browsing in 14 different languages. So we used a previous really nice approach from Johnson in 2021 that extracted using a language agnostic approach, 64 different topics in these Wikipedia pages. And here what you observe is the topic diversity along the y-axis, and then along the x-axis is the more busybody-like or hunter-like score. And the red line is the empirical data, so I just want you to focus on that. So you can see that the busybody-like individuals are browsing with greater topic diversity, and the hunter-like individuals are browsing with less topic diversity. Now, the very last piece that I wanted to show you from this particular study is that we also found that we saw more busybody-like browsers in some countries and more hunter-like browsers in other countries. And what we wanted to know is whether that difference might relate to social or cultural norms or structures that might either constrain or expand the kind of curiosity that people may have or be coming to Wikipedia with. So in particular, what we observed is that there's a very strong relationship between measures of inequality, so specifically gender inequality and education inequality, that are correlated significantly with the degree of busybody-like browsing versus hunter-like browsing. So what you can see here is the rank correlation and the 95% confidence interval. The fact that this is positive here means that countries that have greater gender inequality are those that have browsers that are more hunter-like. And countries that have greater education inequality have browsers that are more hunter-like. By contrast, the countries that have greater equality, both in terms of gender norms and in terms of education, have more busybody-like browsing, more diverse topics, wider set of jumps. We also see a correlation with how homogeneous versus diverse the topics are that are being browsed. So in the countries that have greater inequality, we see more homogeneous topics being browsed, whereas in countries that have greater equality, we see a more diverse set of topics being browsed. So there are a lot of different possible explanations for these effects. I'm going to raise 3 possible ones, but we can't tell with the data that we have which of them might be true or whether something else is going on, but it does motivate future work. So some possible explanations are that patriarchal forces and other forces of social oppression could drive a narrowing of curiosity practices and a relative constraining of knowledge production approaches that lead to this more hunter-like curiosity at the expense of other forms of curiosity. But it's also possible that the browsers in these different countries have really different demographic compositions. We don't know anything about the age of these browsers, the gender of these browsers, the educational status or attainment of these browsers, or their socioeconomic status. We have none of that information, and all of that could be relevant to how they're coming to Wikipedia and the kinds of steps that they take. Lastly, browsers in these different countries might have really different motivations for coming to Wikipedia. Some may be coming more for work, others may be coming more for entertainment or for boredom. So future work needs to figure out, which of these might be driving the effects and why. Yeah. In societies that have evidence non-equality, but actually the related to education are more taught. Yeah. Yeah. Get more access to education. Yes. That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. So the hypothesis is that it's possible that countries that have greater gender inequality will have browsers that are focused on educational sections of Wikipedia because they're using Wikipedia as a way of educating themselves. Yeah, that's a great question. We have the data and could ask that, but we haven't looked at it in quite that way. I think that would be really, really interesting. Yeah, I want to self-educate in this area. Yeah. Yeah, I love that hypothesis. That's really interesting. Okay, so what we've done over the last couple minutes is that we started with looking at individual people, the 149 participants in our laboratory study, and then we moved on to trying to understand curiosity styles across countries. And so naturally, it should be time to move to worlds and universes. But although I have an affiliation with the physics and astronomy department, I know nothing about astronomy, so we're not going to move to universes. What we're going to do instead is to ask whether we can use these ideas to think differently about AI and the kinds of artificial intelligences that might be important and interesting to build. So in particular, what I'm excited to ask is, can we design artificial agents who can build knowledge networks with these really different styles? And then what kind of networks are they building and what may they be useful for? In addressing this question, what we do is that we want to train agents to build networks of knowledge using reinforcement learning. But what we want to do is to reward the function of the edge. So we want to make this explicitly relational, going back to the very beginning of the talk. We don't want it to be acquisitional. We don't want the reward to be on the node. We want the reward to be on the edge, on what kind of relationships they're building between items of knowledge. So then the question is, well, what are the functions of edges in this space of ideas, and how would we reward them? So there are 3 different functions that edges can offer to humans, at least as postulated by theories in psychology. So I'm going to walk you through these 3, and then we're going to use them to inform the AI. So first, edges, in the context of what's called information gap theory, edges are useful and fulfill a function because they fill a gap. They fill in a hole in your mental model of the world. And that's useful for you because you now have a more full and complete model of the world to take with you into the future. According to compression progress theory, which is that our curiosity drives us to build networks of the world or models of the world that are more compressible because it's sort of less costly to represent in the mind and easier to put in memory. In the context of that theory, the edges have a function which is to make the network more compressible. So you can say, well, if I add this edge, does it make the network more compressible? Yes or no? If it does, that's great. It offers information that lowers the cost of mentally representing that model of the world in your mind. And then lastly, according to conformational change theory, so this is a theory that says curiosity is a drive to build networks that can conform, can change shape, are malleable or adaptable when new information comes online. So I don't want to build something that's completely rigid with all of the holes filled. I want to build something that leaves room, leaves openings, leaves spaces so that I could move it or change it as needed. So this theory suggests that important function of an edge is that it makes the network more conformable or more changeable. So it's information that leaves room for the mental model to change its shape. So how do we assess those edge? We need a value, right, for the reward on each edge. So how do we quantify whether an edge is filling a gap, whether it's making the network more compressible, or whether it's changing the conformability? I'll just briefly say, I'm not going to go through the math, but I'm just going to briefly say that in order to assess whether an edge is closing a gap, we use applied algebraic topology and calculate Betti numbers, which is kind of the number of gaps of various sizes and whether the edge would close them. For compression progress theory, we have to estimate the compressibility of the network. And for that, we use a tool that's based on information theory, or specifically on a rate distortion theory of random walks on networks. And then lastly, for the conformational change theory, we actually use notions from mechanics. We think about the network as a mechanical system that can change its shape, has rigorous structures in triangles, has non-rigorous structures in squares or pentagons. And we use those tools from mechanics to calculate the conformational degrees of freedom of the network. So in doing so, we're then able to have networks that are built that close gaps, and that's going to increase the network density. And in sort of a mental or psychological space, we would associate that with building networks that have more cognitive rigidity. Through compression progress theory, if each of the edges that we're adding compresses the network more, we're again going to create networks with high density, also associated with cognitive rigidity. But the benefit is that that network will be less costly to represent in the mind. And then lastly, with conformational change theory, as we add edges, we're going to decrease the network density because we're opening up spaces in the model. That's going to decrease cognitive rigidity and increase cognitive flexibility. But it will come at the cost of a more pricey representation in the mind. Okay, so now what we're going to do is go back here and say, these are the kinds of edges that the agent has an option to lay, right? So we're going to put them down. The artificial agent is going to sit inside of a place in the network, and then it's going to choose an edge to add because of what that edge does to the network. So we can place a reward on an edge that closes a gap. That can be useful for this deeper knowledge. We can place a reward on an edge that increases compression, useful for memory, or the reward will be to place an edge that increases the conformational degrees of freedom. And again, I think that's useful for a type of cognitive flexibility. So when we do this, we are basically sitting in an environment where the agent has a visited subgraph that they've already spent some time on, and then there are some candidate steps that they could take. What we do is that we evaluate all the candidate subgraphs by adding each neighbor to the already visited subgraph, and then we train the agents to choose from those candidate subgraphs based on a graph neural network parameterized Q value of the different steps. And those Q values denote their long-term potential to create or to close gaps or to improve the compressibility. So you can see an image of what that would look like conceptually here. So these are agents that have, these are networks that have been built by agents that want to open gaps. And these are networks that are built from agents that want to increase compressibility. So in the paper, we have examples of how to actually do this formally, and also what kinds of networks are built by the individuals. But what I want to focus on right now is to ask, what do we do with that capacity? Once we've built these agents and have them trained, why is that useful to us? And I think one of the ways that we want to use that is that we want to understand what constellation of drivers and in what proportions explain these human curiosity styles that we've seen as they vary in different contexts. So we can break that down into a couple sub-questions. What kinds of networks are constructed by each cognitive driver? If you're just driven by information gap filling, you just want to fill all those gaps, that's what drives you, then what kinds of networks would you create? By contrast, if you're driven by the conformational degrees of freedom, what kinds of networks would you create? And then the second sub-question is, what happens when we actually are driven by multiple of these? We have multiple drivers inside of us. Yes, I kind of like to fill gaps, and I also like to branch out and connect something new that opens up this wide space I know nothing about. I kind of like both of those. So what kinds of networks would I build if I liked both, if both of them were meaningful to me or rewarding to me? So in this case, what we do is that we have the edges reward determined partly by the change in gaps and partly by the change in compression, let's say. And lastly, how well do these networks actually fit those constructed by real humans? To address that question, we compared all of these networks that the agents were building to real walks that humans have made in 3 spaces. One is Wikipedia, which is a game where you have to start in one place in Wikipedia and you're told where you need to end, and you need to try to get there with as few steps as possible. So we can see participants walking in that particular way. Movie Lens is a movie watching Amazon-based data set, and then Amazon Books as people move through different books. So what we can do is that we can check with all of these real human movements in real spaces and ask, can we predict human movements on these spaces when we use agents that have been informed by these kinds of curiosity drivers? And what we show in the paper is that we can predict human behavior better when we incorporate these cognitively based drivers than if we use something really simple like a page rank baseline. So that suggests to us that the human drivers for curiosity are important in explaining human behavior on these real network systems. Okay. Now, I want to address a question that might be in many of your minds, which is, how does this approach differ from a typical reinforcement learning approach to curiosity? So in reinforcement learning, curiosity is typically used as a means toward a goal, and that goal is to explore better so that the agent can solve a specific task better, right? So what that means is that curiosity-like rewards encourage visits to surprising areas or to novel states in the available environment. And those rewards are often defined in task-agnostic terms. What our approach does that's different is that the exploration incentives are not only task agnostic, but they're also completely content agnostic. It doesn't matter what space you're in or what the content is, because these rewards are not on the nodes, and the nodes are where the content is localized. What matters here for the exploration incentive is what the edge is doing to the network topology, right? And what that does to the mind. So that means that these incentives are completely content agnostic. They're also explicitly relational rather than acquisitional or unitary. So our formulation is detached from the semantics of any environment that the agents are localized on. And I think this means that there's something important to say about the relationship between the kind of curiosity styles we are studying and what's thought of or what's talked about as meta-learning. So we know that learning is important when we have a task in front of us, but we also all have this capacity to learn how to learn. So this is what meta-learning refers to. It's learning how to learn. And I think that curiosity is something that could be one of these fundamental drivers of learning to learn. So something that's behind meta learning. And if so, then curiosity might provide both a structural and a more dynamic explanation for this content agnostic and relational set of mental processes that support these the learning of these metacognitive manipulations. So that's something that we really want to focus on as we move this work in the future. So with that, I just want to summarize where we've been. We started in philosophy, and I focused on some work that was done by Perry Zern, and that we talk about a little bit in our book, Curious Minds, The Power of Connection. I then moved into psychology and focused on a paper that David Lyden-Staley wrote that was focused on 149 participants browsing Wikipedia. We then moved on to global human behavior, and this is work that was led by Dale Zhou and was just published at the end of last year. I'm really excited about it. And then lastly, we ended in how we can take that view of human behavior, which is historically and philosophically grounded, but then also scientifically manifested in humans today. We take that into the building of agents that kind of rethink how curiosity might work, both in terms of how it can explain human behavior, but also in terms of new questions that we can ask in meta-learning. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the people who are important in the work. I tried to point them out as we went. I think I missed pointing out Shubhankar Patenkar, who is the student who did the work in reinforcement learning. Jason Kim is the person who developed the techniques that we've used for conformational degrees of freedom. David Lin is the graduate student who did the work in expressing or developing a new way of thinking about network compressibility. Matthew helped in a bunch of these projects as well, as did Anne. And then we really want to thank the Wikimedia Foundation for sharing their data with us and for the really fun collaboration. So with that, thanks so much for listening. I'd love to take questions. Yeah.
Any way to see how this kind of abstract topology map to the actual formation of connections in the brain, so to speak, the connectonics, because I would imagine that this topology is somehow a manifestation of how the connections are being formed in the brain.
Yeah. Yeah. How do we do that? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. There is some work that we and others have done in the formation of cognitive maps. So that is when you present information to somebody, how does that information get represented in the brain? And how do the relationships or connections between pieces of information get represented in the brain? So we have some work in that space, as does Anna Shapiro and Tim Behrens and several others. What is distinct about those kinds of experiments, though, is that we present information with a particular topology, and then we ask, how well does that get represented in the brain? Do they really, can we see the topology that we showed them? And so it's a little bit more explicit, whereas what they're doing here is, you know, they're self-motivated to find information, so we don't know ahead of time what kinds of topologies they're going to build. So there's still a break in the train of logic between these kinds of studies and this kind of study. I think what would be really fun, though, is, and we've talked about this in the lab, is to have people come in and do the Wikipedia experiment and then also do our network learning experiments so that we can connect those two pieces together. So is it the case that people who tend to browse in kind of more modular clustered-like networks are those people who also represent modular networks better in their minds, right? So we have some hypotheses about how that should work, but we don't have an answer yet. Yeah. Yes, thank you for asking. I didn't put it in because of time, but this paper in one of the final sections has a section on the dancer. And what we needed, we couldn't do it in the first study. We needed a couple people who had really long trajectories where we could see that they were focused on browsing here for a while and then they moved over here and were browsing and then maybe they might come back. So it's something that is where we assess some of the history dependence in the time series. So you can see them in that paper. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so I don't know the answer to your question, but my hunch is, and I have no data to support this yet, but it's motivating what we want to do in the future. My hunch is that what is adaptive is figuring out how to use all styles and then also when to switch between them. So when I think of, the reason I think that this is true is that when I think about a scientific project, at the very beginning of a scientific project, I think a lot of us tend to be more busybody-like. Maybe we read articles or books in different areas. We go to seminars that might not be very closely related to what we're doing right now. We try to expose ourselves to a lot of new ideas, right? And then once we find something that we're excited about, then I think we turn on the hunter-like curiosity style. Okay, I'm going to really think hard about this. I'm going to develop the experiments. I'm going to test the hypotheses. I'm going to really, I'm going to dig deeply and in a focused way. And then when I'm writing the paper, I think I need to switch it to more of the dancer-like curiosity, because I have to say, well, how is this discovery related to a theory in this other field or an experiment from this other lab, or you have to kind of build these bridges conceptually that contextualize what you do and motivate future work. So I think even in the course of a single scientific project, you use all three. And it's what I feel like I partly learned in graduate school is when to stop hunting. My advisors would be like, it's time to write the paper. And I think I got a better feel for that later, as I had been in science for a couple of years. But I think that's, yeah, what I'd love to test is the hypothesis that what people learn in training is how to use all three and when to move between them. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. I'm just curious if in addition to the length of the article, is there a why the cultural pages are more pages than shorter? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but we also have the time spent on each page, which might be an even better predictor of what they're doing, because they might not have, I rarely read the whole page of it. Yeah. So what's probably important is how long they stayed. It's a good question. We do have that data, but we haven't looked at it yet. Yeah.
Embedding curiosity, either like AI, would be an adaptive thing for better AI models.
Better AI models in general?
Like on our path to quote unquote HI.
Yeah.
Curiosity is such a part of intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think probably if it was going to be an important part, I think it is maybe through this notion of more meta learning and the content agnostic learning. I think that's something that has been less focused on in the previous literature, and I think it could be interesting to use that and see what it could offer these agents in artificial contexts. Right now in my laboratory, I'm more interested in building them in order to understand humans. So I'm bringing it back to the human. But I think if you wanted to just build better or different or novel artificial agents that can do something different, I think the fact that this approach is content agnostic becomes important, or might be important. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Hi. Good to meet you. Oh, sorry. Was I supposed to? I'm sorry. Okay. The person who, yeah, left. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, Anna was just like, you're giving a plaque. So.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. I thought because she left, I needed to end it.
I realized that she left, and I realized that